GCC FinTax is Middle East's first dedicated platform for tax and finance professionals to share tax news, information, and articles on varied topics of tax and finance. And we intend to target all the 6 GCC countries. You can connect with us on various social media platforms also, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and on our app also. I can see people are still coming in. So in the meantime, just a few basics about this webinar. I would request you all to keep your microphones on mute, please. You can use the chat facility to type in any questions that you have. We'll have a question and answer session towards the end of the webinar where we'll try to take in as many questions as possible. You can type in your questions in the chat box, and in case you wish to interact with the speaker, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. And since we are live on Facebook as well, so we'll be taking questions from our viewers also for the same. So coming back to the webinar, today, just briefly, we'll be discussing how tax professionals can transition into the UK market from a global background and the best ways to optimize this search. Our guest speaker for today's webinar is Ektaa Kumar, who is heading the tax recruitment for Morgan McKinley at UK. Ektaa, thank you so much for taking out time to conduct this webinar. Ektaa, over to you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Ektaa Kumar. First of all, a massive thank you to GCC FinTax and CA Club India for inviting me to come and speak to you all about sort of opportunities in the UK tax market and how best to optimize your search. Just by way of introduction, I lead the global tax recruitment team for Morgan McKinley, which is a global recruitment and consulting firm headquartered in Ireland, but with offices sort of across the globe. We're going through quite an interesting time at the moment. I'm sure everyone is experiencing something similar across the globe at this stage, you know, with the backdrop of a global pandemic, things changing on a daily basis in terms of sort of news and developments on sort of how to liaise with sort of our colleagues. We thought that this would be a really interesting time to really discuss how best to optimize your search, whether it be sort of on a local or an international stage. But to also go through, you know, sort of the tax market from a UK perspective and give you an update on kind of what is happening out there, what we are seeing in terms of sort of developments from a skill perspective, so that you guys around the globe who are looking to either relocate or get some experience here in the UK market are able to sort of position yourself in the best way possible while things are changing. So I thought we'd start with sort of a bit of an update on the UK tax market and what has been happening out there. It has changed. I think that's the first place to start off. I think, you know, with a lot of the backdrop of a global pandemic, naturally the skill sets that are sought after in the UK have started to really shift from, you know, kind of the day-to-day BAU stuff to kind of being a little bit more geared towards what we're calling the recovery program over the next sort of couple of months. But the introduction of the sort of change in skill set actually really started back in 2013 when BEPS and OECD was introduced to the UK. You know, I think we really saw a shift in skill set from sort of aggressive tax planning and structuring to sort of what is almost a bit more of a governance skill set, which has almost been, I guess, threefold highlighted during this time of the pandemic. The change in skill set, I think, has really reflected what a business needs from an immediate tax perspective. And by that, I mean things like indirect tax, debt restructuring, and sort of those sort of more immediate skill sets are what we're seeing in the market at the moment, especially over the course of the last 6 months. Cash tax is massively prevalent in the UK at the moment. I think businesses during this time have really been focused on their balance sheets and looking at sort of what that looks like and almost making sure that they are as healthy and as strong as possible, we're seeing a lot more going into investment for tax automation, whether that be making tax digital from an indirect tax point of view, or automating sort of the compliance and reporting process. I think technology has played a massive part in what is going on in the UK market at the moment, which is reflected in the DNA of the tax team, where people have been, a little bit more interested in sort of what that automation skill set looks like at this moment in time. Transformation has been an ongoing, I guess, topic point in the UK for the last 3 years. I think people are really looking at the external projection of their tax departments and what that means in terms of sort of the ethical environment around tax. Are we paying enough tax? Are we doing it in the right way? Are we sort of optimizing, or rather managing the balance between business activity and sort of the tax strategy? And that really has become prevalent, and I'd almost say the backbone of sort of what the tax professional in the UK looks like at the moment. I think there's a lot to do with kind of governance and that transformation skill set, and migrating into something that allows for tax professionals to really transform the way that tax is, tax is perceived in a wider environment, whether it be across finance or across the general business function. The last thing to touch on in the UK is obviously with everything that's happened in the last few months, people have been working from home a lot more. So remote working has been on the rise. People have been forced to work either from home or remotely in sort of their own, separate hubs, to explore the best way to, kind of continue working and continue contributing to a commercial environment. So this really fits into what is happening right now so well, just because of the fact that all of a sudden people are starting to be a little bit more creative, particularly, heads of taxes and CFOs globally that we deal with. They're starting to almost shift the kind of mind frame of looking at things like remote working or agile geographical location working as almost a bit more of an embrace. So as a bit more of an open option for them, just purely given the fact that the last 6 months have sort of meant that we have had to consider it. I think one of the, if we can say this, one of the main benefits of coming out of the last 6 months, one of the stronger positionings coming out of the last 6 months from a job seeker's perspective, is that the opportunity has grown, and the kind of ability to be a bit more agile in terms of where you are based globally, and thinking outside of the box rather than the traditional, going into an office and tapping in from 9 till 6 or 7 p.m. I think that is really what is being reflected and contemplated at the moment. So for all of you that are looking for international opportunities or localized opportunities at the moment, I would say this is probably one of the most interesting times to be in the market. So I thought we could sort of start off first with kind of discussing how tax professionals transition into the UK. Now, there isn't a hard and fast answer about it, to be honest. I think it is all about sort of positioning your skill set and positioning your criteria prior to your arrival in the UK. Now, as I touched on slightly earlier, the DNA of the tax professional in the UK has changed so significantly from being less aggressively planning, structuring, and kind of funky in terms of sort of the tax creation. It's been very much more so on the governance focus. The UK has been subject to so many different regulatory changes and legislation changes over the last 24 to probably 36 months. So we're seeing all of these new legislations coming into the fold, like DAC 6, anti-hybrid mismatch clauses, tax transparency, publication of your tax strategy. So I would almost sort of say from now, whether you're planning on relocating in the next 6 months or the next year, I would really start to be positioning yourself with that in mind. The tax departments globally obviously call different things different titles, but I think the kind of methodology and the approach that you should be taking to your career in the next 6 to 12 months is very much around governance and reporting and compliance and strategy publication, getting involved with automation. Those sort of skill sets is what I would highly recommend sort of lending yourself to. Globalization is definitely increasing, and I think that's definitely been reflected in our client base, not just sort of in the UK, but internationally. All of a sudden, we are seeing less segregated hubs across sort of certain geographical international locations such as APAC or kind of the Australias, the USA. Prior to, I'd probably say the last 3 years, we really saw a bit more of a segregated approach to taxation and that being reflected on a global stage. What we're now seeing with the multinational corporates, whether it be places like Amazon or Reckitt Benckiser, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, people are all really starting to consider the role of a tax professional on a global basis, not just segregated to a specific entity, whether that be EMEA or APAC. So in a way, if it's available to you from an option perspective, I would definitely start to be talking to your companies about sort of transitioning yourself from wherever you are based in the world at the moment into a more global focused role. And by that, I mean getting some sort of exposure to global taxes and international taxes. So things like transfer pricing, debt restructuring, international reporting obligations, international liaison obligations. I think all of those things will be very useful for you to position yourself to kind of start to look at sort of what your options are abroad and in the UK. We have seen countless amounts of individuals sort of specialize a little bit too early in terms of their local hub and then found it very, very difficult to relocate to London and to the UK just because of the idea of obviously the tax systems being so different. Now that is definitely going to be the case. I mean, whether you're coming over from the States or whether you're currently sort of based in APAC, naturally there is an element of the tax system being very specific to where you're geographically based, but the kind of methodologies and the experiences from a discipline perspective that you can get exposure to at this moment in time, I would advise to start to gear those towards something that's a little bit more internationally recognized and going for something that's very specialist in your current market. There is a lot around sort of the intercompany transfer side of things that I tend to get questions around and sort of whether that is an option. Definitely is an option. I mean, I work with a whole host of people who use the route of, you know, an international big four firm or an international global presence firm to sort of get an opportunity from a global perspective to kind of come over and have that experience. I think it's something that's becoming, you know, a lot more common in a normal environment, but given the current situation is sort of maybe a bit more sparse and a bit harder to come by. So it's really about sort of, I think, positioning yourself from a skill set perspective at this moment in time to make sure that you're transitioning into the UK with enough of a background, enough of an international exposure, and enough of a stance point from a tax perspective to kind of take an easier entry into the UK. And from my perspective, from where we have seen people succeed the most in that, it really has been where their global remits have been more pronounced over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, rather than being very specialized within a certain area within their localized country. The next question then becomes, how do you position yourself in the current market, right? You know, kind of coming over and transitioning into the UK is one thing that is obviously so specific to everybody's journey, but is also, you know, very sort of segregated skill set in terms of sort of how to position yourself. The main thing actually, you know, whether it's localized opportunities or international, is sort of how do you position yourself in the current market that you're in at that moment in time. And that really lends itself to, you know, how you approach your job search and how you begin to start to develop your own skill sets and start to develop your own stance point in the current job market and position yourself in such a strength that when an opportunity comes along, you are ready for it and you've almost done all of the groundwork prior to getting this opportunity, that you are in the top 3% quartile or the top 1% quartile that would be considered for these opportunities. And that's not only a technical tax skill set side of things, that's also positioning yourself smartly in the current environment and positioning yourself within both the localized and international tax space so that you are a recognized brand name and you are a recognized talent to be, you know, somebody that can actually make that transition and make it quite easily. So this is going to be applicable to people who are currently searching for a job, not just on an international forum, but also in a national forum. I advise a lot of the people that I work with to not just look at the immediate goal of sort of, right, I want to be based in the UK or I want to be based in the UAE or the States, wherever you want to be in the world. It's almost working backwards from that and knowing that's the end goal, but sort of working a few steps behind that and saying, how am I going to position myself to getting there? How am I doing everything, not just technically, you know, I've got the qualification, I've got the technical expertise, I'm being recognized in my current firm. Not just that, but also how do you, as an individual, as a tax professional, present yourself to the broader market? Because Obviously, with information being so much more readily available in this day and age, people are wanting to hire individuals that are thinking not just inside the box, but are thinking outside of the box as well in terms of their brand name and how they're positioning themselves in the current market. So the first thing, which sounds very, very obvious, but we don't sort of see it enough actually within tax professionals on a global basis, speaking to contacts and networking across your social circles and tax circles is massively important to get a localized sense of what is happening, not just in your jurisdiction, but also sort of across the national landscape of where you are at the moment is so important, because it will allow you to kind of almost then inflect and say, where can I spot the opportunities for me to take a step into? Where can I find an opportunity across the tax remit that I can actually kind of take a step into and then use as a springboard into an opportunity sort of across the pond. So speaking to like-minded professionals, connecting to other colleagues and kind of peers across the tax remit, not just in your siloed company that you are working for at the moment, but across the market is hugely important. The second thing that I would highly recommend is speaking to recruitment agents. Now, recruitment agents are really interesting and obviously vary across the world in terms of sort of their level of professionalisms and kind of capacity, but also their network. I would say take your time to speak to a few and really develop relationships with the ones that you have either seen, whether it be on LinkedIn or sort of various other job posting websites, or you have heard from your colleagues who have had experience in moving people internationally and sort of locally across sort of your remit as well. The interesting thing about the recruitment sector, in particular within the UK, is sort of they sit at the helm of sort of the operations that happen across the tax market. So they're often the ones that will hear about what is happening in the tax space first. You know, they'll know a little bit more about what is going on from a move perspective, which CFOs are looking to invest in their tax team, which CFOs are open to hiring people with an international background, what the quotas are for certain people moving across to the UK. So I would highly recommend having a relationship with a recruitment agent that you feel very comfortable with, who would be able to provide you with insights on how to best position your experience in your current market at that moment in time. I'd also use this time, particularly in the next 6 to 12 months, to be speaking to your line managers and try to position yourself to get experience within the sort of areas that I've mentioned already. So things like tax risk, tax regulatory changes, cash tax, indirect taxes, transfer pricing, debt restructuring. Those are all of the areas that I think if you can gain some synergies towards will definitely put you in a better stead moving across the market and will definitely benefit you on the longer term basis. One small hint and tip from my side that I tend to give a lot of the people that I work with is that your CV, you know, people put so much energy into kind of focusing on their CV and focusing on sort of what their CV kind of looks like and the wording around it. The reality is your CV is a working document. You know, you should have a basis in terms of what the CV looks like and have a basis in terms of what the credentials are. But you need to see that document as a working document. So the different positions that you will apply for internationally, you will take different elements of your own experience out and kind of position that towards the area of expertise that you are applying for. For example, if you are specified in corporation tax at the moment, you've had a huge amount of experience across the corporation tax remit, whether it be compliance and reporting, transfer pricing, operational taxes, or kind of indirect taxes, you will draw out certain elements of your experience from that CV. So sort of have your CV as a consistent working document and don't just sort of keep it as a one-off, this is all I'm going to kind of liaise with. I would definitely sort of have it there, make notes of the things that you are doing over the next 6 to 12 months and start to add and draw out from your sort of base document, depending on what it is that you're applying for. The other thing which is really important, and I kind of mentioned slightly earlier, is sort of developing your brand. So by that I mean being very active on social media, being very active on LinkedIn, joining certain groups, particularly in the UK, you know, various tax forums, PwC sort of initiative forums, future leader forums from Deloitte. It's a very important exercise just because you were developing your own brand name prior to coming into the UK market. And I think that will allow you to sensibly develop almost a sort of client base and a kind of almost network based prior to kind of coming over to the UK, which will only sort of position you a lot better when you look to do that. Now, that kind of obviously positions yourself in the localized and the international market. The second part of that is obviously when you do relocate to London and what that is like and what the process is around it. Now, every company will have very specific areas and specific ways of dealing with that. But, you know, the current market as it is at the moment is very tricky. You know, I think the opportunities just even for UK living here, you know, are very few and far between given the current situation. I think the tax perspective in the London market will remain challenged up until the end of the year with certain things like furloughs and changes in the environment given the pandemic sort of coming into use. But I would almost use this as a time to be really strategic and use it productively. It may not be an immediate process in terms of relocating, but take this time to really reach out to contacts, make acquaintances with recruitment agents and kind of start to talk to people across the pond about sort of how you need to be transitioning into the UK market. Certain banks and firms and international kind of clients that we work with will have a specific set quota for relocation allocations, which is going to only be changed in light of the pandemic. I think we're going to see that sort of reducing ever so slightly in the next couple of years, but we have definitely been gaining insights into sort of CFOs, heads of taxes and heads of human resources teams starting to tell us that the quota will only sort of start to grow come next year, given the fact that sort of remote working, global international working and relocation is becoming a bit more of an option for people. So I would start to have those conversations and almost sort of look at the longer term plan now, just so that you've got a longer term option sort of in your mind and you're sort of strategically placing yourself in that way. The visa sponsorship for the UK, again, is a really tricky thing. You know, I think employers are definitely more likely to sponsor in the UK in specialist areas of tax. So things like indirect taxes, transfer pricing, FATCA, operational taxes. These are all areas that we will see a kind of higher likelihood of kind of people sponsoring in. The process tends to differ company to company, but you tend to have to go through something called a resident market labour test, where the company is required to advertise the vacancy for 28 days externally to the job market in the UK, and only then can they begin this sort of sponsorship process to relocate somebody over to the UK. Definitely something that we have seen recently. We have helped a host of different people across South Africa, India, the UAE to sort of start that process off and have a good entry point into the market. But what we are seeing a little bit more common now is the intracompany visa. So sort of coming over with a global firm that are based in your respective sort of geographical nations across the world, getting that sponsorship, coming over and then sort of transferring your visa into an ICT visa sort of once you get here. I think that obviously provides an element of risk averseness just from your point of view. It gives you an opportunity to come into the UK market without really being, you know, worried about sort of if I land here without having anything, you know, where do I go first? How do I kind of get that entry point? And it really kind of allows you to be in a position of sort of security once you come into the market, but with the opportunity to then sort of move once you are here. And I think that definitely, you know, is probably one of the more common routes that we see people coming into the market with. I think having had already done all of the work that we mentioned earlier in terms of positioning yourself and getting yourself in a stance point kind of way back from when you are, you know, in your respective countries, I think kind of coming over with that sort of mind frame of sort of, I've got the security of a big international brand behind me, I've got the security of a big international company behind me, I think definitely helps a lot in terms of sort of coming over and kind of starting off that process. The last thing, which is more of a kind of softer point on kind of opportunities, is kind of factor in the cost of living and the tax rates here in the UK. You know, relocating from family and friends, getting a kind of base here in the UK. We've seen a lot of people do it very successfully, and the reason they've been able to do that is because they've started their groundwork while they've still been at home. They haven't just sort of landed in the UK and started the job search and the kind of brand building from the time that they get here. It really is, you know, I'd say a 6 to 12 month process prior to pressing the button for you to kind of really get a strong landing in terms of sort of your arrival and your sort of transition into the tax world sort of here in the UK. The last point I think is more, you know, kind of reflective across sort of the entire the tax market and the job search market. But it's a moving dial. There's, you know, a lot of different things to consider, whether you're happy in a role, whether you're not at the moment, whether you're considering international opportunities, or whether you're looking at opportunities that are, you know, kind of more national towards you. The best candidates that we deal with in the market are the ones that consistently keep their ear to the ground. And by that I mean deciding that they are investing in their career, they are going to invest in terms of their job search, and continuously looking at the developments and hearing about the developments in the market at that moment in time. You know, it's a kind of old saying, but I think kind of better the devil you know, when we're in this sort of situation where people feel that they are, you know, being very focused on their certain job, they're very focused in their certain kind of, you know, remit of things, and kind of hard to look out of the box. But I think the best individuals that we have seen in the market that have definitely transitioned into the UK a lot easier with the tax space are the ones that sort of continuously keep their ear to the ground, keep learning, keep, I guess, growing, keep developing your own skill sets and your own role, and pushing through the ceilings that kind of exist from a tax perspective. Because I think the most sought after candidates in this current market are the ones that are challenging the status quo and seizing opportunities with both hands. It's a small market in terms of sort of the kind of opportunities that presents itself in the UK at this moment in time. So you want to be ahead of that. You want to be ahead of everything that's coming out prior to it actually reaching the market. And in my mind and in my experience so far, there have been the individuals that have been very proactive in terms of sort of building their own brand name and keeping themselves sort of very in tune with the market. I think what the last 6 months has really taught us about the job search is that adaptability is crucial. You know, I think everybody would have started 2020 with a certain plan in mind and a certain, you know, kind of approach to the job search in mind, and have had to find that they've had to pick the rule book up and rip it up and throw it out the window, just because things haven't obviously gone as we've all planned over the last couple of months. But I think this is really an opportunity for you all to be positioning yourself and starting to kind of really think about, actually, you know, in 12 months time, where do I want to be? And in 18 months time, I want to be relocated to the UK, or I want to be relocated somewhere outside of where I am at the moment. How do I then work backwards from that and start to gain sort of topical exposure here in the UK and sort of from an abroad perspective? So the biggest thing would be to kind of keep adapting, keep changing your sort of stance from a job search perspective, keep yourself in tune with what is going on in the market, especially from a UK perspective. Read on various sort of forums, get involved with various forums in terms of sort of contributing, so that when you come here to the UK, you are in a better position to kind of start to optimize that search. And that is really it. I think, you know, a lot of it is independent to your approach to the job search and how you sort of started to do that. You know, I think kind of whether our tax expertise allow us to be easily transitioned into something that is sought after into the UK, or whether there's sort of a bit of an agile route that we have to take to kind of get there. I think that the main thing to take away from these sorts of forums and webinars is that you need to be seen to be able to kind of do that, and you need to be heard to be able to do that. So building yourself from now, rather than applying on a case-by-case basis, building your own experience and positioning strategically your own experience from this point is really what's going to help you moving forward.
Thank you, Ektaa. We'll be taking questions now. So the first question, Ektaa, that we have received is, what are the most common difficulties expats face when they move to UK?
What are the most common difficulties that people face when they move to the UK?
Yeah, for expats when they move to UK, what are the difficulties that they face?
Yeah, sure. It depends how you've come over, really. If it's through a company, then, you know, obviously there's some sensibilities around sort of navigating a new environment, kind of getting into the new fold of a business, kind of having equal opportunities and having opportunities to really see. I think we find a lot of people sort of come across in terms of a difficulty. If people are locating without, you know, the kind of umbrella of a company behind them, I think the obvious difficulty is the kind of shock of being someone new. That is a very, you know, costly and expensive place to look. It's not the easiest transition, but I think there are certain support groups and certain groups that I would recommend, which I urge anybody to kind of get in touch with me if you would like specifics around that. But there are certain groups that are set up to sort of have an easier transition into the tax market and have a, easier transition into the space. I think one of the most common difficulties that we see with people looking for a job, particularly from kind of, I guess, the UAE, the India and the APAC market, is that the skill sets sometimes aligning becomes very difficult because of the localized tax systems being very, very different, right? You know, I think certain things, whether it be sort of CBCR versus sort of the intercompany, interstate sort of tax visa side of things, it's a very different tax system. And I think the one thing that people commonly make a mistake on is almost presenting their experience as a little too local. You know, I think this is what I meant by having that sort of grounding prior to coming over. Positioning yourself in the best way prior to coming over is really the kind of the way that you avoid that. And the way that you do that is sort of getting yourself into a corporation environment, getting yourself into a multinational corporate environment, or looking at things that are a little bit more international tax focused rather than sort of state EU tax regulation.
Okay. Ekta, there's one more question. It says of all the profiles in taxation, like we have indirect tax, corporate tax, transfer pricing, international tax, etc., etc. Which of them do we see the most recruitment of international accountants?
Yeah. In the UK, I'd probably say the top two are transfer pricing is a massive area for international talent. As I'm sure all of you know on this call, transfer pricing obviously is something that knows no bounds from a kind of country perspective. Transfer pricing element of things obviously came in a bit stronger into the UK back in 2014 with the OECD BEPS that sort of came in. It is something that has really, we saw a massive boom in the market back in 2013, 2014 of people running to the market to hire transfer pricing professionals. And then a real lull, I'd say, over the last sort of 2 years, up until the beginning of 2019, where we sort of started to see that pick up a little bit more, where the kind of regulations became a lot more complex around CPC. So transfer pricing is one of the main areas that I would say that we see an entry point into. The other that we do definitely see, again, a big entry point into is indirect taxation, probably the second to transfer pricing, but sort of still a massive area. Kind of, again, depending on how people have badged it from a UK perspective, but sort of most of the time, indirect taxes, particularly with MTD, the change in indirect tax legislation and the reporting on indirect tax has become a lot more global here in the UK. We're not seeing as many opportunities coming in that are UK and EU specific. Actually, indirect taxes have started to become sort of a bit more international. So indirect tax, I would say, is sort of one of the kind of more specific areas, particularly actually in the last 6 to 12 months, that we've seen people sort of gravitate across with in terms of skill set.
Okay. The next question, Ekta, is for an Indian chartered accountant, what's the average desired experience required to start looking for a tax job in the UK?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I think your line went slightly quiet there.
For an Indian chartered accountant, what's the typical experience required to start looking for a job in the UK?
In the UK. Okay, it depends where you are with your chartered accountancy. If you've gotten the qualification, I would say you want to go and get some years in experience in terms of the in-house market. So sort of working for either a multinational enterprise or a multinational corporate, getting an entry point post-CA into a firm that obviously deals with sort of commercial in-house tax issues is probably my next port of call. There isn't a deciphering years of experience at this moment in time. It really depends on what it is that you're applying for. Typically, what we have seen being a little bit more tricky for individuals is where they have been, you know, very, very qualified out in whether it be India or the UAE, coming in and transitioning into the UK market as a head of tax or as a tax director is a little bit more tricky rather than sort of the more junior end of the market. The reason being, you know, not only is it because of the years of experience versus sort of are you then able to go to another tax jurisdiction and pick up the laws around that, it's more to do with the UK market from a kind of a need perspective. The kind of top end in the UK markets are sort of senior manager, director, heads of taxes, VPs, very, very saturated in terms of candidates in the UK, just because obviously there's been a lot of an exercise been ongoing for the last sort of, again, probably even say kind of 4 to 5 years, where people have been restructuring their tax departments and almost sort of having a bit of a think around sort of, do we need somebody so senior in the tax department, or do we need somebody who's more of a senior manager taking a step up? So there's been a lot restructuring and redundancies at that level, which has just meant that the candidate pool for people who are available for these sorts of positions with the UK experience has expanded, which therefore makes it a little bit more tricky for people coming into the UK to kind of be the first position for those roles. And that will depend on kind of obviously where the company has a presence. You know, are they geographically based out in India? Do they have a presence in the APAC region or the UAE region? All of those things will affect it. But I think generally speaking, we have found it slightly easier to help individuals who are transitioning into the market at the sort of 3 to 4 years post-qualified, rather than coming in at the head of tax level here in the UK anyway.
Okay. So our next question, Ekta, is again an Indian CA who's working in UAE in the field of indirect taxes. So his question is, how doing CTA with focus on indirect tax will help him relocate to UK or EU?
Is the question how would the CTA help him, or whether him or her should do the CTA?
Yeah. No. He's already an Indian chartered accountant working
Okay.
in UAE in the field of indirect taxes.
Okay,
So his
fine.
question is, how doing CTA with focus on indirect taxes will it help him in relocating to UK or EU?
Absolutely. The CTA is a widely recognised qualification in the UK. Again depends on who you're dealing with and who you're working with, but I'd probably say about 70 to 80% of our clients definitely have a slight bias towards people who have got the CTA qualification. It definitely wouldn't hurt you to kind of obviously get that qualification just as an entry point into the UK. Obviously the syllabus is kind of very sort of EU UK focused. There's a lot on the international tax remit of things which you might get some sort of synergies with. But I would definitely advise sort of getting that under your belt. It's not a complete necessity, I think, if you're already based in the UK or the EU, if you're looking to kind of move around sort of locally around that. But I think if you're looking to kind of push yourself up to the kind of 1 to 3% of quartile of kind of candidates applying for things, I definitely would recommend sort of going down that route, just because it provides you again with a bit more of an entry point for clients to look at side by side and say, actually, you know, even though this person has had a lot of international experience, naturally with all kind of GST and GCC coming into the UAE, that's been a focus, the indirect tax, but it also gives you something that's a bit more localized to sort of the EU and the UK market for people to kind of obviously preference over there. So I would recommend doing that, yeah.
Okay. So next question, Ekta, is again, I have a UK qualification from CIMA. How can you start looking for a job in UK while sitting in India if you don't have a work permit there? How can we help you?
It's a process. So it again depends who you're employed by and what you're doing at the moment. If you have a company that you're employed by that has international offices and is open to a relocation and hasn't filled their quota, then I'd start to navigate your internal landscape and start to have those conversations with your people teams or your HR teams or your employment teams about sort of what the prospect around that is. To look for a job in the UK, the biggest entry point for me, you don't necessarily, depending on what positioning you're coming into, need a permit initially. You can speak to individuals that are based in the UK, recruitment agents who will be able to point you in the right direction to companies that are open to international relocation, and begin your search from that. So I would start by, again, if you're working for a multinational corporate, start to have those conversations about an intercompany transfer visa. If you're working or if you're not working at the moment, or if you're looking for something that doesn't have an international sort of office presence, then I would start to get in touch with recruitment agents in London and start to kind of feel out what options are available to you prior to kind of obviously launching that.
Okay. Ekta, I think you have already answered this question, but there's a question on the work permit, as in who generally handles the work permit application, the visa cost for the applicant. Is it managed by the company or you have to take care of it? You have
Have
to
to
manage.
take care. Yeah, it's different. It really depends on the company. I would say 90% of the people that we work with, and 90% of the UK market will often handle it themselves. Depending on whether you're coming solo, whether you have a dependent, the costs will vary. So a lot of the time what companies will do will offer you the sponsorship, conduct the interviews, etc. If you're not in the UK already, virtually, present you with an offer. after the offer, they will kind of launch what they call the market or the labour market testing, which takes 28 days, where they are required legally to kind of advertise the position externally to the UK market to prove that there is nobody else in the UK market already in country who can do that role. They will then launch the sponsorship process. Now, a lot of the time, the company actually bear the cost of that. So certain company will bear the cost, but they will introduce certain clause into your employment contract that either have a deductibility clause per month from your annualized salary that will pay the cost of that visa back, or they will have what they call a clawback clause, where if you relocate to the UK with said company, if they have paid for the sponsorship of your visa, you are unable to leave said company for sort of it normally is 2 years, but I've sometimes seen it 3 years. You're unable to leave the company for 2 to 3 years. But more often than not, it's the company that will take that expense. I've seen maybe 10% of the market where the individual takes the expense, but that is more when the individual has come over first without securing a job, rather than actually coming in as an entry point with a company. But more commonly, we will see that the company will incur the expense for that.
Okay. Ekta, there's this question, and there are multiple people who have asked this question. It's, can my spouse work in UK on my visa?
Depends on what visa you're on. It needs to be a co-dependent visa. So your spouse will have to also have a separate visa that's applicable. And again, it will depend kind of how you're coming over. There's not a one fast rule. I mean, the most common tends to be the tier 2 intercompany, as I mentioned, so sort of the transfer visa, in which case your spouse will also have to apply for a certain type of tier 2 visa, which then allows them to work in the UK. A dependent visa is the one that I think is most beneficial if you have a spouse coming over with you, where the company will have either sponsored you or you have an entry point into the UK. Because it's a dependent visa, it's slightly more expensive, so sort of some companies may shy away from it, but that will mean that your spouse is then able to kind of work in the UK as well. But it really just depends on kind of what visa you're coming over to the UK with. I would say if you have a choice, go for the dependent visa if you're in that situation. But naturally, because it's slightly more expensive, we don't see as many people sort of having that opportunity, sadly.
Okay. Next question again, it is similar to the one you have already answered, but it's about an ADIT degree. So the question is, for a person wanting to make a career in transfer pricing in UK, does having the ADIT qualification degree, is it a prerequisite? Is it an important prerequisite?
It's not necessarily. I think, there's an age-old battle between qualification versus years of experience sort of in industry. If you're just starting off in your career and you haven't had any experience in transfer pricing so far, then I would definitely look down the route of the qualification. Again, it's about separating your own application from sort of the 100 others that sort of clients are going to have in front of them. So the DIT, while it's not, a requisite, it's definitely something that will strengthen your application if you're starting your career off. If you're already a few years in, you've had the experience of a big 4, a top 10 or an accounting firm, and then you've moved into sort of an in-house environment and you've got 8-9 years of transfer pricing experience, it doesn't tend to be as prevalent or as important in that sense. It really just depends on where you are in your career.
Okay. Ekta, the next question is, what are the general visa conditions? Can I change my employer once I land there after a while, or I'll have to be restricted to one particular job?
You're more often than not restricted to the particular job for at least a certain amount of time. This links very closely to the visa point that I just mentioned. If you are on an ICT visa, you are pretty much bound for a certain amount of time with the said company. It doesn't mean that you can't move, but it just means that once you've already got the sponsorship coming into the UK with, whatever firm is that you've come with, you then need to seek sponsorship from another firm to be able to kind of move over to another firm, which isn't impossible at all, definitely happens. But the other firm that you're looking to move to will have to obviously incur the kind of obviously visa cost and the sponsorship for you. Definitely you can move, definitely can change companies, definitely can kind of change opportunities, but you will have to work for a company that is open to sponsorship.
Right.